forgot I was supposed to do this.
Yeah.
Don't be self-conscious.
It's pretty informal. But yeah, John Jevons, it's Geavons. He's got a couple things out there. But yeah, I've been using his advices. We've been using it at the company that I'm with. So we're planting stuff in people's yards. What the heck? Permaculture. So permaculture is different depending on the permaculturalist you talk to. Everybody's got their own opinion. So it doesn't really matter all that much. It's what you do, not what you call it, I think. And that's kind of at the core of what the jam's all about. I took a permaculture design course, but it didn't really make sense until I spent time off the beaten path in California with the tribal linguists and ecologists of the Chaca Maidu Nation, who, short version of a long story, ended up taking language classes from them and getting turned on to traditional ecology and traditional land care. It's kind of an interesting story. The guy who is, this is in Central California, up in the Yuba River area.
I'm moving a little closer.
Yeah.
I can't quite hear you with all the...
Yeah, it's small, so you feel free to gather around. Yeah, so...
And this was which people did you do this?
The Maidu, which is a little tiny band of California Indians who live kind of upstream of Sacramento. Anyway, so this fella Farrell Cunningham was pretty much the last native speaker of Maidu. It was a nearly extinct language. Everybody who spoke it was in their 70s and 80s, except for Farrell, who was mid-30s. He grew up in a traditional way, way back in the backcountry. His mom was Swedish, and his father was Maidu, and his mother spoke better Maidu than his father did, go figure. But anyway, so he traveled and studied as a linguist and as an ecologist all over the place, Japan, Europe, and so on, and was kind of looking at the history, the interconnection between traditional languages and the care of the landscape in the old-fashioned way. Because in California, you have a landscape that was tremendously lush. There's another great book, Tending the Wild, by Kat Anderson, that goes into extensive detail about just how the people who live there managed to live in such dense numbers in close proximity to one another and in the midst of tremendous natural bounty. This is a place, part of the world, where there's like 500 distinct language groups cheek by jowl with one another. Places that have morphemic linguistic structures that are probably more about this than I do, but where the languages show a time spent apart long enough that the indication is that there are these people who live really close together and haven't fought or invaded one another for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. So they figured out how to do things really well. If you can live cheek by jowl, trade with your neighbors, increase the fecundity of the landscape, and not get into serious fisticuffs. Hey, welcome. No, don't worry about it. Just talking about traditional land care. Saying how I was out in California, I spent some time studying ecology and linguistics with the Chaca Maidu tribe. This gets into permaculture. It's what happens if you do it right. But anyway, so thousands and thousands of years of living in place and increasing the fecundity of the landscape and not fighting. And so anyway, so my buddy Farrell was studied with the Ainu in Japan and was asking them sort of the same question, like how is there was a tremendous degree of linguistic diversity, tremendous amount of biodiversity until the Japanese invasion. What were the elements of their traditional culture that allowed them to live with such a fucking landscape? And it came down to the words, the language, and the grammar of how they were talking about the place. So he came back to California, back to his tribe, and said, we need to pass on this language because the grammar that we have talks about a relationship to the landscape that English doesn't have. And if we lose that sense of relationship, the land isn't going to get taken care of. The hills will burn. It's a very fire-prone area. If you don't tend the forest well, it'll catch the fat. So he approached the tribal elders and said, can I teach this language and have it be part of the broader culture again? And to do it. And so he opened up language classes. When I was there, he was just beginning to start opening it up. And so was reaching out to partner with Anglo land trusts to get pieces of land set aside and so that it could be managed in the traditional way. And then I worked with him on a project to connect mostly Anglo landowners with Maidu grandmas and grandpas who are still gathering basketry materials, still gathering traditional medicines and processing in that way. Because when you do that, you're helping the land to regenerate. These organisms evolved with human beings after the last ice age, and so humans are a keystone of that landscape. And something struck me. I thought, well, shoot, the Maidu aren't the only people who have lived in a fecund space. What about my own ancestors in Lithuania? Look at this lush forest that the Balts came screaming out of, Mongolia in the year dot and lived there for 1 million years, and this incredible rich landscape till the Teutons came in and kicked us out. So maybe there's something going on there. Maybe there's something going on like that in, the Cisalpine Gauls before the Romans did that to them. So, and you see that in the archaeological record. You see that in the linguistic record. All of these terms for the landscape in relationship to it.
Can you give an example from?
Sure.
This language, the Maidu?
Maidu, yeah.
Like a term
Sure.
that would.
So there's a, what is it? The ponderosa pine, the big tall pine trees, they call them bubum ta, and so bual is wind, and bubum is the diminutive of that, so little wind lessening, and ta just means tree. So bubum ta is the wind lessening tree because they planted them as windbreaks downhill of the oak orchards. Because when the big winds would come up from the south seasonally, the trees would sway back and forth and dissipate the wind so that the acorns wouldn't get knocked down in the 200-year hurricane or 200-year windstorm that comes up through there every now and again. And so there's also histon, which is the gray willow, and histon means weaving stuff. Means a bunch of sticks that's about as long as your forearm. And so that tells you what season you need to harvest that plant, how much material you need to take at a time, and so on. That's all just in the name of that plant. And so everything also has 2 or 3 different names. One of them is usually an onomatopoetic term when you're dealing with animals, like solely for the squirrels. That's the sound that the squirrels make when they're alarmed. Solely. You say it with a growl on your voice. Or kaiskun for the jay. That you hear the jay scold in that kaiskun. So, and then there's also, a sacred name that you don't use outside ceremony. And then there's a practical name that refers to what it does. But kind of the one, glad you mentioned that because I nearly forgot about that. The one word, and this is kind of why I was bringing this back into permaculture, that really struck me was this word yahatidum. And it was the name of the foundation that we started out there. It was the Achata Yahatidum, which is the forestry care project. But Yahatidum, so in Maidu, everything is a verb. There kind of is no adjective. Everything is an active. And there's no subject and there's no object in the grammar. It's all kind of participant. And there's a neuter form that's used more often than the male or the female pronoun. So it's kind of the opposite of a lot of European languages in that way. But yahatidum means is the process causing it to be good. So yahadum is gooding. T implies it's done. It's a process that's ongoing. And so yahatidum is used to describe doctoring when somebody's sick, like setting a broken arm or giving medicine or helping somebody give birth. It's used to refer to a favor done to somebody, like that's a good gift. That's yahatidum, it's a giving of a gift or something. But it's also the word that's used for forestry care. What we call land management is yahatidum. So like when you go out to the woods and water a bush, you take back some firewood with you. You break it off from the bottom of the tree. That way, when the wildfires come through, they don't climb up the dead branches and crown and sweep through the forest. Or it's like harvesting your histum tree. That would be yahatidum too. And so that the same word is explicitly used to refer to the care of the land by humans in a good way. It's like, wow, here's a culture that has no guilt about being a part of the landscape. Whereas we have this tremendous, like, take only pictures, leave only footprints, don't go off the trails, don't pick the flowers, don't feed the birds. We should be feeding the birds and the bears, all that stuff. We're gonna build a connection that's reciprocal. We need to start participating and not just observing. And so permaculture is kind of, in a weird roundabout way, our Western worldview kind of coming back to that perspective. There's unfortunately very little paid attention in the early years of permaculture. A lot of it was inspired by very similar type of work done by Aborigine Australians in Australia, and looking at the historical record of land care in Tasmania, where the natives were completely genocide out of the picture by the British invaders. But yeah, the early years, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison were famous as the coiners of the term permaculture, did a lot of work with the nations there. And so that's really where permaculture comes from. It's our attempt to work with the land, to do good by it, everything else that comes out. And so I was thinking about, what's the most important aspect of permaculture to bring up? Because it's like, teach physics in an hour and a half. It's kind of a broad subject.
I was wondering how you're going to do it.
Yeah, right. I think the idea of emergent properties, maybe that's a heady enough thing that it'll catch Sarah Lawrence. The idea that, you do one thing and all these other unexpected things happen as a result of it. And so permaculture is in some ways the science of organizing those unexpected things that come out of dealing with the land or dealing with systems or something like that. And so, and it works. Like, you can see, this is in Holyoke, Massachusetts, with the Nuestras Raíces project. They took this little quarter of an acre back lot, which was horribly polluted, been driven over, been parked on as a junkyard for a while. It was just awful, like grass would grow there. Year zero. Year one with intensive gardening stuff, you start to see the beginnings of a forest garden. It's feeding now about a block's worth of people. And then 3 years on, this was a couple years ago, there's over 500 species of plants ranging from subarctic to subtropical growing in Massachusetts. And then it's year, 5, 7 now. And it's feeding like this huge number of people, providing all of these, it's not the full diet, but it's all the micronutrients that they can't otherwise get in this dense inner city food desert where there's only liquor stores and no grocery stores.
So maybe you're going to get to this, but sort of how does what happens here differ from, I don't know much about farming, but for sort of what you would conventionally do in the same situation to grow a garden here.
Totally. The difference is monocropping versus polyculture. In a word, it's rather than growing, this is the row for potatoes, this is the row for peppers, this is the row for squash. You match it all together. And there's a heavy focus on perennials over annuals. And that comes down to the biology of the plants. Annual plants are usually colonizers of disturbed areas. It's like after the forest fire sweeps through, the annuals are the ones that pop up. After there's a big mudslide, the annuals are the one that pops up. Most of our vegetables are annuals because we come from a culture of a persistent ecological disturbance regime. That's what farming is. That's what plowing is. You're essentially making a mudslide every season in order to plant opportunistic plants in. And so the idea is you don't necessarily want to be living in a mudslide. You want to be living in a forest. And so it's a much more stable, diverse ecosystem. And so you want to be planting crops that are going to give you, the same high return on calories as you would with annual vegetables, but that build soil over time rather than take it away. They build nutritional stuff that build ecological biodiversity beyond just what you're going to eat. So heavy focus on nut trees and fruit trees, perennial vegetables. And then when you have those living systems in place, there's a lot more little niches that you can squeeze in. That's how you can have 500 species of plants in a little tiny city lot. Because you've got a peach tree that creates this exact temperature gradient of shade, which you can grow a Siberian honeyberry underneath, and underneath that you can get a sweet Sicily ground cover for your medicine. And so, the diversity is key, and the attention to detail. So production is seen optimization rather than maximization.
So, how big a lot is this garden in Holyoke, and can you tell us what species are actually sort of?
Yeah, I have a
Flourishing.
slide later on that has some polycultures from this one, but this is 1/4 of an acre.
It's feeding a lot of people, you
So
said.
it's feeding an entire neighborhood, and that's part of a broader. Nuestros Raíces is a big, I guess it's nonprofit. That was started by folks who were recent immigrants from mostly El Salvador and Puerto Rico, but there's folks from all over the world who are part of it, or immigrants from all over the world who are part of it.
This is a community garden?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, it's managed by Nuestros Raíces, but it's kind of for everybody who participates in it. A lot of the families in the neighborhood are participants in some way or another.
Given the focus on participatory versus observational, I'm curious to know when people do projects like this, is there any notion of planting and structuring things in such a way that the amount of maintenance needed is, I mean, so part of me is saying if I want to participate, maybe it's something where I just want to plant stuff that I kind of need to go out there every day and tend to, versus other gardens where people may, I just want to plant something that looks great and requires minimum weeding, minimum watering. I can just kind of leave it alone and let it do whatever it's going to do. Is there any notion of one way or the other?
Yeah, it's kind of like that idea of you want to build a house that's going to fall down so you can get your neighbors together to put a new roof on it, because that's going to bring a community together more than building in a permanent structure kind of a thing. Yeah, there's a heavy focus on low care and less maintenance plants because you want something that's going to succeed and give you a harvest more than anything else.
Yeah.
There is so much work that needs to be done with any kind of agricultural or agroecological process. There's always weeding that needs to be done in order to keep the fruit trees healthy. There's always going to be, pruning that needs to be done with fruit trees. There's always going to be troubleshooting. You need to be out there every day just paying attention and noticing what's going on, because we're all so young at this. We don't know how things work. We're on a 40,000 years in the hole as far as landscape knowledge goes. We've got a long way to go before we understand these processes. So that's kind of more of the participation aspect. There's also, permaculture systems are usually designed to be self-sustaining, right? You choose self-seeding annuals and perennials, but realistically, your irrigation pipes are going to clog up. Your swale's going to get buried. You're going to have made a mistake somewhere along the line. And so usually the first 5 years of any permaculture garden is a whole lot of maintenance and on-site, which is good for bringing folks together. So, yeah. Probably blaze through these. There are as many different core principles of permaculture, and there are people who profess to teach permaculture. These ones, we read too well right here. I'm going to be posting this whole PowerPoint on my website later today, probably, so you can look at that and all the other talks I've given over the years at the Civil Foodscapes website, which is at the end. So you can actually blow this up and read what it says. But anyway, this is what David Holmgren, who is one of the founders, isolated as kind of his key principles of permaculture design. And this is kind of getting into both the ethics and the practical ideas of how you're going to accomplish creating a fecund, thriving landscape. And at core, you're caring for the people who live on the place, you're caring for the land itself, and you're making sure that if you have more than you need, people who have less than they need get it. That's it. Anything you try to do in that aim is probably going to be better than what's there already. And so there's things like the idea of obtaining a yield, or making what's that? Can't work on an empty stomach. So that's the idea. If you want to plant something that's going to give you good returns and provide you with enough work to make you feel like you're doing something with your life. So there's that. That's worth noodling around. I'm sure there's a copy of this somewhere in the massive document about that. But anyway, there's kind of going from the ethical down to the practical scale of things. There's a couple of basic underpinnings. And if you take these kind of as basic guidelines, pair that with your understanding of how natural physics works, water flows downhill. If you catch and store material at its highest energetic state, you can get it to do more work. You can store water up at the top of the hill, or at the bottom of the hill, you're not going to need to pump it to your garden. gather something where there's a lot of it and put it where there's not a lot of it. It's redistributing the surplus. But the two kind of main jargony things that are almost inescapable in permaculture are elements and functions. Element is anything, and a function is anything that does. So if you just think about things in that term, like that beanbag there is an element of the design of this room. And what are the functions of a beanbag? It's comfortable to sit on. It smells grody if you don't wash it after long enough. You know, and so you try to find a way that you can utilize.
I was playing like match up the component to the function, like vice president look pretty.
Your tool shed producing cabbages and you're handicap accessible. Yeah, this probably makes more sense if you look at it this way. They also talk about yields and needs in relationship to elements. And this is a great way to do design stuff. So, you know, pick an element that you definitely want to have. Like everybody between Maine and Georgia should be growing Asian persimmons. I think they're one of the most productive fruit trees.
Should be grown what?
Asian persimmons.
Oh.
They're extraordinarily productive, good protein. They store well if you dry them. They will keep you alive. You should grow them. But then you gotta say, because what do I need in order to keep this tree healthy and alive and producing enough fruit to keep me healthy and alive, and producing enough to keep my chickens healthy, alive, and so on. Say, well, you know, you need, you know, a certain amount of space. You know, a tree's roots, its heart roots are going to spread out to the width of the canopy, and so for an Asian persimmon, it's about a 10-foot circle. You know, so about 10 foot of uninterrupted space, and the tree's feeder roots are going to be in the top 18 inches of the soil. You know, about 5 times the width of that. So you need a fair amount of space. You can plant it, you know, maybe one side next to a road, and you need to have space on the other side for those feeder roots to grow out. And so thinking about the space requirements in order to produce healthy fruit and not die after 3 years. And then you got to think, so what can I do with all this fruit? Because it's going to produce more than you can eat. You know, well, what can make use of that excess yield? Well, you could attract deer to your property and then have venison. That's an option. You could use it for chicken feed. You could use it for storing. You can make persimmon jam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you use an excess of persimmon jam, you're going to have more than you're going to eat. You know, you can give it to neighbors and friends and enemies. It'll be great. So building these chains and these connections are a really good way. You start with any one thing and you connect it to everything else. And so that's kind of a core design practice that's fun to do. More fun to do with many people than one. So there's another activity that I guess we could do. So it is, they call this the wild design game. And what you do is you take a bunch of elements that you've got in a setting. This is just an example of random elements. And you write them on pieces of paper. And you cut them up. And you move them around on a surface. And this part is very important because you'd think, you know, I am a functional adult. I can think about things in my head. I don't need manipulatives. I'm not in kindergarten anymore.
Everybody needs manipulatives.
Everybody needs manipulatives. Yeah. Yeah, you think better. Most people think better with their hands. And there's also something that comes, when we're talking emergent properties, there's something that comes up when you're physically moving conceptual. I mean, you can talk about this. There's when you have it spatially arranged in front of you, and when you're literally using your hands to move these things around, things occur to you that do not occur to you when you're looking at the list, thinking in your head or writing things down in a linear way. So you need to jog in the same way that you're creating a landscape that's maybe outside of the mainstream conception. You need to engage in a design process that's outside of your usual thing if you want to achieve those results. And so this thing is maybe the most powerful design resource I know of. You know, take your garden at home, write down every single thing you've got, every single thing you might conceivably want to have, and everything you can think of that's going on in your neighborhood around you, and you will have a good design at the end of it. It might be a disaster, but it'll be an interesting disaster.
Why are there so many pickle barrels?
I don't know. Maybe you live next to a pickle barrel dispensary.
That's a lot of pickle barrels.
A lot of pickle barrels in there.
I mean, that's like a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot. Actually, speaking of pickle barrels, this isn't really related, but it's good advice. Nobody seems to recognize this. So you know those like rain barrel things, the like single pickle barrel? Get a cistern. If you're looking at seriously harvesting rainwater, you'll go through one of those little 50-gallon things in about anywhere between 15 minutes and a day during the season that you would actually want to be irrigating. So it's, if you're interested in rainwater or rainwater harvesting, you live in a place that has uncertain groundwater or uncertain city services when it comes to water, you're probably going to be looking in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 5,000 gallon tanks, which are pricey, but it's better to have that than to run out of water when you need it. So, permaculture tip. Plan ahead. So I was thinking too, like, what are like the key core practices that will result in good landscape design or good permaculture design or whatever for anybody. And maybe the most important is the observation time. Permaculture makes a big deal about observation in our design classes, and we spend very, very little time actually doing it, which is a little silly. But of course today we're sitting inside and talking about it rather than going outside and doing it. But anyway, I recommend in nature connection mentoring we talk about sit spots a lot as kind of the core routine for learning what the heck is going on in your landscape. And that's, you find a spot and it's got to be close to where you're at. Like if it's more than 2 minutes away, realistically you're not going to go to it. And it doesn't need to be the most beautiful spot in the world, it could be your back stoop, but just somewhere you can go and just pay attention to what's going on in the world. And that is the best way to learn the natural processes in place. Write stuff down every now and again, but really it's just the time on the land. And maybe the most interesting thing that happens when you do this, going to bird language, is you notice your sphere of disturbance shrinks dramatically when you start engaging in routine process. Maybe you've noticed this, that the more you bird, the closer you can get to them without them alarming. It's like when initially you're going out in the woods and you're kind of doing the city person walk, the heel clomp, the hiker, eating the granola bar, the headphones in, and it's funny because, I'll be walking in the woods and I'll see these robins going hell for leather past me, and the toads bursting out of the bush in like a minute and a half, right as rain, it's always somebody out there, yakking on the cell phone, hopping out of the woods totally oblivious, and scaring the shit out of the birds, because they see that body language, this like tense, intense, like I am preoccupied up in my mind body language, and they're going, what the hell is that? And they're getting out of there. But if you spend time sitting in a place, one, the birds get to know who you are. I mean, a bird isn't a bird, it's this one bird that lives in the space that has this little territory. And if you're in that area, it gets to know your routines, that you're not actually a threat, that you're interested in learning about this place. And so, you'll find kind of as time goes on, you start to notice the birds alarming from you, and you go, crap, walking so loudly, I see all these big birds chomping away. But really that's good. If you see them, it means that you're able to sneak up closer to them. That's a reflection on whatever your body language is, and that makes you want to walk even more carefully. And then you begin to notice, you hear all these bird alarms going off in the distance. And you think, oh shoot, I thought I was doing so well, and now I hear all these bird alarms going off. Well, really, those are the secondary alarms, because what's going on is the foxes, the possums, and the wildcats, or whatever that are in your area are being surprised by you out of their day beds, and they're going off in the woods and are causing the birds to alarm. So that's what they're hearing. And then, you modify your step even more, you slow down even more, and then you're all of a sudden walking underneath and singing robins, and you're seeing the deer in their day beds kind of looking over their shoulder at you. You're seeing the foxpups playing in the den. And it gets better and better from there. So, but the key practice is just being in that landscape. You'd be amazed how much wildlife there is in the urban environment in suburbia. Just last night over by Marshall Field watching this fox.
Oh, you've seen
We have a family.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, and if you're on a place like this campus all the time, you see these processes. But anyway, it's important because things will occur to you when you're on the land about garden design that wouldn't otherwise. Plant a tree. In urban situations, a little trickier because you've all got to do it as part of a community project or something. But
You planted gochis,
I have, yeah.
and you actually get berries from them.
So there's the two species or the two varieties, right? There's like the cultivated goji, and then there's the wild type, the
Mhm.
Elysium barbarum, the undomesticated one. I've had much more success with the wolfberry
Really?
barbarum than I have with the domesticated goji.
Yeah, because I've never actually seen them grow produce fruit.
Yeah, they require really alkaline soil, and so like most of the
I guess that makes sense since they're like mountain growth.
yeah, totally. Like where I'm at, it's really acidic soil naturally. So what I've been doing is forgetting what the stuff is, but oyster shell definitely, and then this gray powdery, it's like slate dust or something like that. And that seems to. I mean, I've got one growing underneath an Asian pear right now. It's grown this much this year. It's nuts.
Wow. Wait, what's the snake dust? I'm sorry.
Slate dust.
Oh, slate dust. I thought you
Yeah.
said snake
dust. Yeah.
I was like, what?
Very, very. Careful what you ask about it. Yeah, no, I mean, I even heard that there's a fella I know who does mostly mushroom growing, shiitakes and oysters and stuff. He's been growing quite a bit. He says they have the potential to be a major invasive species. They're so vigorous.
We find oysters everywhere. I find my takis in the garden. It's amazing. Like there's so much mushroom growth. But
Did
yeah, I definitely eat them. But it's amazing.
Did you inoculate, or did I
No.
spring it up?
They're all there in Brooklyn. Everything. We have reishi. I mean, they're the North American reishi, but
Yeah, still.
it's all part of the system. Mushrooms are pretty important, or
Yeah.
fungi, I should say.
Yeah, I have so much more respect for the Atlantis tree, the tree of heaven that gets a bad name all over the place. This is mega invasive. All of the best oyster mushroom harvest I've ever had all come from Atlantis.
Atlantis, Norway maple, and all poplar, and we find them on willows a lot.
Willows, too.
Yeah, willow. I always thought they would taste a little funny on willow because it has such a pungent smell, but
Right.
they're actually pretty good.
Yeah. Does it carry over any of that salicylic acid or whatever it is?
I don't know. To be honest, I haven't tasted it, but usually I saute. So
Nice. I wonder if that would be like a headache removing mushroom grown on a willow tree. Because the salicylic acid in willow leaves is the same stuff as an aspirin, same chemical. So, yeah, I mean, I guess they're all trees that grow quickly and tend to snap or break in heavy windstorms. And so, like, I know it's the old advice is with an old mushroom, once you give it a kick or you throw it on the ground, and that vibrational shock causes the fruiting bodies to form. And so, again, all these Atlantis groves that are just snapping back and forth into hurricanes, it's a huge shock that's traveling all the way down to the trunk, and the mushrooms pop out. So I'm wondering if it's a dynamic like that. They're also all fairly softwood trees,
yeah.
so oysters seem to like that as well. Anyway, so I've got a better image of kind of the layout for a garden like this, but you want to think about one, choose a variety of tree that's good for the area that you're at. You don't want to be growing anything that you can get in the supermarket because those are for the most part commercial varieties that require intensive chemical and fertilizer regimens, and you don't want to be in that crowd. They're very difficult to grow without that chemical support structure. And so you want to be looking at heirloom varieties that have been cultivated for your area, or alternatively, East Asian varieties that grow in a similar latitude and a similar forest type that have been domesticated, in many cases longer than the European fruits have, and so also tend to be resistant to most North American diseases. And think about those things. Also, North American fruits, pawpaws, elders, American persimmons, which I don't think are as tasty as Asian persimmons. Similar trait. But those are all good bets for around here. And then, think about, rather than tree, mulch, circle, lawn, that's fairly artificial environment. Nothing's going to do well there. It's like being in an office building expecting them to thrive, not our area of evolutionary adaptiveness. Going in the desert with no water kind of thing. Plants grow, trees grow in these big tangly, thickety, wildernesses as they're succeeding, and then, when it's a climax ecosystem, you've got a big bushy canopy, wide open understory. But in the meantime, you've got your canopy species, and then you've got your stories and so on. And so, imitate the landscape that you're in. Figure out what's going on, what are the natural patterns where you're at, historically, not just right now, but what's the natural succession pattern, and imitate that in your own gardening. And so I always recommend planting, at the very least, plant a tree with some companion plants. And so in general, you want to have something that's going to bring in good bugs. So those are plants in the carrot family that have umbels, which are flowers that have a whole bunch of little parts to them. Plants in the composite family. Hey, welcome. That are good for sunflowers and daisies and asters and stuff like that, that all bring in lots of solitary bees, which we're probably going to need to be relying on for pollination over the next couple of decades as the bee populations continue to crash. We kind of broke that one and have to own it now. So, if you want pollination, you're going to be needing solitary bees. A lot of times, too, we're also dealing, especially in suburban and urban environments, with fairly denuded soils, whether it's the area around a suburban house that the basement was excavated and the subsoil was plopped on top of the topsoil, so that's what we've got to plant in. So you need plants that have deep taproots that can bring nutrients up from the B and C horizons in the subsoil and make them available through their leaves or through their surface roots on the surface. So plants like comfrey, chicory, dandelion is one of the most fantastic medicine and landscape healing plants there is. Remarkable plant. You can incredibly nutrient-rich leaves. You can make a million things out of the flowers, wine, great in salads. It's an amazing multi-use plant and potent medicine too from the root. Makes a decent coffee substitute too if you dig up the root at the right time of year and dry it and grind it and roast it. So anyway, plants like that have a deep taproot are going to be really important for keeping orchards alive. And then, in general, you want something that's going to buffer soil temperatures, especially in a time of increased climatic disturbance. You want anything that's going to add a little bit of ecological stability to your garden. So living mulches are very important.
What are the ones I can't see under the vetch?
The
What's
bottom
under
is a vetch clover, which is a nitrogen-fixing plant. Makes a great lawn. Tends to be sturdier than grass, especially on slopes. Legume, the pea family, so it brings in atmospheric nitrogen, fixes it in the top couple inches of soil, so good for that. Yarrow is a phenomenal medicine plant. I drink yarrow blossom tea just about every morning. And
That's what they said. Achilles was dipped in yarrow by his Achilles heels, and that's why his Achilles heels weren't invincible.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's Akalea.
Exactly.
Plant.
Achilles.
And then chamomile is another good one. That's also has a, it's good at colonizing disturbed soils and turning. It's a bioremediation plant, so it can turn a lot of polluted soils into healthy stuff. So they're all great plants to plant underneath your trees.
So before you go, I'm sorry to keep
Yeah.
interrupting, but just interesting footnote, the bottom butterfly, the giant swallowtail, has been a sort of interesting indicator of the generally warming temperatures. And like 2 years ago, you never saw them north of like New Jersey. They're a southern species. And in the last 2 years, I've had them in my backyard in northern Connecticut. Just like, wow, and they're really amazing. I mean, they're huge and really beautiful.
I saw my first one since I was a teenager, like about 2 years ago.
So they've kind of made this northern incursion in the last couple of years because of the weather. So
It's amazing they're moving that fast too.
Are they always one of the more early butterflies coming in, emerging with the swallowtail?
Sort of
they're midsummer.
late
Yeah.
All right, so I thought maybe they were early emergence because I saw them in New Jersey. So I guess it's not that strange, but it was. I didn't see any monarchs or any of the other butterflies, except for maybe some of the smaller ones.
I've seen some black swallowtails already.
Right.
Yeah, I
tiger
think
swallowtails.
There was some tiger swallowtails, and then I don't know what the darker ones are called.
Right. Usually black swallowtails or sometimes spice bush swallowtails. But anyway, the giant swallowtail has that sort of triangle pattern on its wing with the big spots. And
It's beautiful.
it's like, wow. They were at my garden. It's like, whoa.
So do y'all have zebra swallowtails around here?
I haven't seen
They're the
them
black and
since
white
I was
stripes,
6.
smaller than a tiger.
Yeah, no, I think they're also more of a southern species, I think.
Because they eat, their caterpillars eat pawpaws, leaves. So if you see tiger swallows, excuse me, if you see zebra swallowtails around, then you know there's pawpaws around.
Oh.
Pawpaws are
Indicated.
fantastic eating.
Huh.
The fall time.
One of the butterflies I saw were in our kindergarten classroom.
Oh yeah.
And they were
Neat critters. Okay, so this is a little bit more what I was talking about, doing guilds or polycultures. The words are used interchangeably.
Oh, could I? Sorry.
Yeah.
What about in terms of plants? I was thinking of the monarch, and they're caterpillars that feed on milkweed.
Yeah.
Oh,
What's the value of milkweed?
Yeah. Oh, milkweed is a great plant. It does have medicinal benefit depending on the part of the plant that you use. I have not had a whole lot of connection with that plant. All of the Asclepias genus is good for that. There's like the swamp milkweed, the tuberosa, dogbane, which is another Asclepias, and there's a couple of other ones. They're all excellent butterfly forage, but as far as I know, the monarch is the only one that can tolerate the milky sap, the milky latex that's on a handful of them. And so, in general, like butterfly bush, that big fancy plant. Don't remember the name on that one.
What else?
The butterfly bush.
Oh,
silky gray leaves.
It starts with the B as well. It's I'll think of it. It's considered invasive though.
Right.
Buddleia.
Buddleia, thank you. Yeah, that stuff is. I've heard it's if you've got that, you also need to be planting some Asclepias around because the nectar that you get from the Buddleia is of an inferior quality. Like there's less sugar per weight or something, less calories per weight. So the butterflies will drink and the hummingbirds will drink their fill on that stuff. They'll try to move the same distance that they would using the native pollen and nectar that they're used to, and they'll just fall right out of the sky because they don't have the energy reserves.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
I think that the sap, it's the latexy sap that comes from it, from the milkweed. They used to think that it could eat flesh, so they used to put it. Well, it does a little bit, I think, but they used to put it on if you had a wart or a boil or something, they would actually put the latex sap on. I don't know that it actually worked all that well. So.
Yeah.
But I know it does have medicinal properties, but I don't remember.
Yeah. I mean,
Exactly.
I know it's
in
antibiotic,
teas.
it's antibacterial, and the root has. God, it's something for internal bleeding or something like that. But it's one of those, get to know the plant well and trust your list kind of thing. Don't muck about with it. And dogbane, which is another one, Asclepias clan, is a phenomenal cordage plant. You take the stalks when they're dry and you crush them up, strip the outer the xylem off the outside, and you can spin a really strong cordage. The only problem is it's really toxic, so don't ever stick in your mouth. Cordage like that. Yeah, so planting pattern is also kind of sort of important, thinking about the layout of your plants when you're sticking your stuff in. So these are down below here, these labeled sections are from the Nuestros Raíces garden. And these are some sections of these kind of interesting hybrid, intercontinental gardens. So you've got, honeyberry, which is a Siberian honeysuckle, right next to Anise hyssop, which is European, right next to sweet Sicily, which is Southern European. And so kind of all this stuff come together. Russian country, Welsh onion, European Henry, all together in one place. And so a lot of permaculture is trying to play fast and loose with the idea of native and invasive, saying pretty much, everything's invasive now, looking at where things are going climatically. If there's anything alive on this planet in 50 years, we're going to call it a victory. We need to stop this planet from turning into Venus. And, a plant like bittersweet or Asian honeysuckle or Atlantis that turns atmospheric carbon into plant matter really, really quickly is some of our best friends in this world. And so, kind of taking the long view, we are in an extinction event. Extinction events, a catastrophic loss of species over a geologically short time period, right? We're losing, we can stand to lose something like, somewhere between 75 and 90% of the species currently on the planet, pretty much within our lifetimes, give or take a couple hundred years. And then that's sort of an interruption, proceeds for about anywhere between we intend to go on a trail. You know, we intended to get to the Susquehanna River, and we just got so distracted by this big, beautiful meadow that we never got there. But it was interesting. We wandered off of the trail into this big, overgrown meadow that I guess he got a farmer's fields that for whatever reason he couldn't take care of anymore and just let go. And so it was these big thickets of Russian olive, which is Leagnus, and bittersweet, huge, big, thick bittersweet vines, European cherry, and ground cover that was mostly stilt grass and garlic mustard. So pretty much an entirely invasive plant community. But there were also, little lilies and orchids underneath it there, and there was more birds in that clump than I had heard the entire, in the tulip poplar wood that we've been walking through before. And so it really, deer trails all over the place. We saw rabbit scat everywhere, bobcat sign, raccoon sign, fox sign, like just this incredibly lush place, almost all opportunistic species. And so it made me think about kind of the party line that invasives are always bad, they always reduce biodiversity. And, if the alternative is a landscape blasted with 2,4-D and glyphosate selectively planted, I wonder.
I think, did you ever read One Star Revolution?
Yeah.
It's a book where he basically figured out it's almost like permaculture in a lot of ways, but I think in the book he actually doesn't think that invasives are too bad. Like they're just one and the same. They're just plants that found an opportunity and are able to take over in a situation.
Yeah.
So, it's just an interesting way of looking at invasive species.
Yeah. They're also, most of what we call invasive species are kind of are disturbance colonizers, like our annual vegetables. They take hold in a disturbance regime, like the edge of a city or something like that. And then plants like garlic mustard, the scourge of the eastern forest, can get shaded out.
You see how important the invasive plants are in an abandoned city lot when they're all just taking over, and eventually they'll make the soil right for other plants that will come. I don't know. It's a pretty amazing cycle.
Yeah. If you change the perspective between figure and ground and see the earth as being a real process and the city as being something that happens to the earth, it's taking a desert and turning it back into a forest.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, universally good.
I feel like sometimes, depending on, I think, to your example, there are times when I think, I'll see people talking about weeds and trying to get rid of weeds, and then sometimes I think, what is a weed and what is not a weed is purely subjective.
Totally.
There are some weeds that are beautiful. Maybe they're not something that you want in there if they're going to choke off other stuff. But
I think we've been taught to think a certain way. Even working in a botanic garden, we're taught to think something is beautiful where, one generation has one idea, next generation has another idea. And maybe through education and refiguring what we think is beauty, maybe with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely necessary. We need to be intentional about how we teach aesthetics, particularly with regards to the land. That the aesthetic of diversity, of lushness, may be over linearity and straight lines. And there's room for both.
With what you said in the beginning, reconnecting to nature and figuring out how we can live with and stuff.
Totally. There was something, David Orr, who's a professor of eco something or other at Oberlin, said at a talk to when I was here. It stuck with me, and that's we all experience sustainability whether we choose to benefit from it or not.
That's pretty powerful.
So let's find beauty in it, because it is. And definitely, humans have been making lush landscapes for as long as humans have been humans. We are perpetual keystones for good or for ill. Anyway, make a map. That's a really good way to connect with your landscape, is draw a map. David Sobel, you kind of did stuff with mapping for kids.
That's really cool. I met this nonprofit last weekend in Brooklyn that has a list of, I don't know if you've encountered them at all, but they have a list of every government-owned empty lot because they want people to make
That's awesome.
gardens.
Is it Bronx Green up? Or I'm sorry, Greenbridge?
maybe. I have their information.
Because they work through the garden if it's Greenbridge, because they try to figure out every single city lot where they can
That
build
might
more
be
gardens.
it. They're gonna help me with like my school garden.
That's amazing. That's great.
Yeah.
That's sweet.
So they were like super cool. They're like, we just want everything to have a garden. They're like, there's no use in having an empty lot when you can have a garden there instead, and you could be feeding people out of it.
The big thing is guerrilla gardening too, where people like make the, they like put seeds in
The seed
the
bombs?
seed bombs.
Yeah, they were making seed bombs at their stand.
Like the guy that did One Star Revolution, he made them, but he called them something entirely different. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
and then I made
But
a bunch of seed bombs.
That's
with them.
that's awesome.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I love that stuff. Guerrilla grafting is fun too, where you go on the fruit trees and you take scion wood from you. So there's like Bartlett pears all over the place. So you take like really good, productive Asian pear scion wood and graft
That's
it
such an
on it,
awesome
right?
idea. I've never thought of that, but that's a cool idea.
Some of the cohort and I are going out this winter after pruning season.
My grafting abilities are terrible, but that would
No,
be a good way to work
so
on
we need to practice.
it. It's a good way to work on it.
It is. You know, you just put like 6 different ones on the tree. You know, 2 of them make it. Hey, great.
So, excuse my ignorance, what are seed bombs?
You basically just pack mud or something like I think some people can use even like I don't even know manure
Like
or like
mud and like
and you put a bunch of
soil.
seed in it, like maybe wildflower seed, just something that might look pretty, or any kind of seed really, right?
Yeah.
Just throw it over the fence.
Yeah.
If it grows, great. If it doesn't, no harm lost.
Or she was like, you could also just like plant them somewhere.
But I mean, if there's like a close-in area, I've heard of people just like taking them and just like chucking them in if it's
Yeah.
fenced in.
You just drive around.
And then she
out
also
the
just
window.
like gave me like a handful of like she was like, here are some sunflower seeds I cultivated. I think they might still be in my purse actually.
Cool.
That would look awesome.
They take being green gorillas seriously.
Although they're actually an organization telling you to do that, it sounds like so.
Yeah, I mean they're an organization that I'm working with now.
Telling you to throw seed bombs.
I mean, this was not like a sponsored event, so there were like small children making them.
Yeah, I was
Great.
going to say, the great kid activity.
Yeah.
for sure.
Mud pies and slices. Yeah,
This map reminds me of a project that's going on at I have a 5-year-old daughter who's just finishing up daycare. And the place where she goes to daycare is what used to be an old elementary school. So it's, the building itself, and then they have a lot of land around them, and there's conservation land kind of surrounding that. So they really have this beautiful area. And one of the things that they're doing, that they started I think a year or 2 ago, is transforming part of what is currently just kind of some scrub trees and some kind of open field area into a playscape, but it's a natural playscape. And they basically mapped out the area just like this, and they're not putting in metal slides and all this stuff. They're working with a landscape, and all of the features that they're building into this kid's landscape, it's going to be completely natural. It's going to have like walking trails, rocks to climb on. If a slide is going to be built, it's going to be built using a hill that exists there.
That's pretty cool.
So they're working with what's there in the environment, and it's just this neat thing. And it's going to be open actually to the whole town. It's not just for the daycare center. Concord, Massachusetts.
Our
that's
Child
good.
Development Institute has a lot of resources around that kind of thing.
Oh, really?
It sounds like you've got it covered, but
Yeah,
yeah.
it's just so cool to watch too. And they've got a map posted,
That's
so like
really
every time I
neat.
drop my kid off, I can kind of look at the map and see what they've been doing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really, really neat project. And I love that they're opening it up to the whole town.
Yeah, that's
Anybody can
nice.
show up and.
Well, the hope is always that then you get more people to do things like that.
Right,
You build
right,
it slowly, and they'll
Yeah.
come.
I think one of the big things that scares me about our culture these days is that we have become so, to your point earlier, you put people inside a box where they sit there and, type at a computer all day. They lose complete touch with the outside world and any respect or appreciation for the nature. And there's some neat, I just love some of the programs that people have come up with to help reconnect to nature. There's this other program that I saw, which isn't directly related to nature, but I think it still applies a little bit. My wife and I were living out in Illinois for a couple of years, and apparently the town that we were living in had a lot of problems with vandalism in the cemetery. And and it's this beautiful cemetery, you know, beautiful Bloomington, Illinois, beautiful cemetery, and a lot of history there, in addition to a lot of wonderful trees and so forth. So what they ended up doing was the local kind of playhouse, if you will. They would go into the library and pick out anybody in kind of the town's history of note. Could have been the first mayor, or could have been some famous person that did this. Didn't necessarily matter if they were famous or not. And then each of the actors in the playhouse would kind of become that character. They dress up in the period garb of 1800 or whatever, and they would lead tours through the cemetery. And you would walk through, and the guide would be telling you primarily about the land and the plant life that was there and so forth. And then every now and then they would stop and say, I'd now like to introduce you to so-and-so. And you would kind of come around the bend and you would see an actor standing out there in the cemetery kind of frozen in place. And then as soon as the tour guide stopped, the actor would come to life. And they would just give you like a 5-minute spiel about who they were and what they did in their lives and so forth.
That's really
Actually,
interesting.
Greenwood does something
We do that.
similar.
We do that in my town. We have it up for Halloween. We have a
Oh,
cemetery
really?
walk, and I've
Yeah.
played various characters
Oh,
over the
oh,
years.
oh.
And, war heroes and
Yeah.
doctors, and
Yeah, exactly.
various things
Yeah.
like that. We haven't done sort of the landscape focus as much,
Mhm.
but it's an interesting idea to kind of incorporate that into it.
Yeah, I
Greenwood
just
does
thought it
that
was
as well.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Like for different seasons, like they'd have a Civil War thing.
Mhm.
It's neat. But that's
Yeah.
that's
But
great.
you really leave the tour, it's maybe an hour or so, you leave the tour with an appreciation not only of local town history, but you also walk out saying, that cemetery is beautiful.
Mhm.
And like it would make you want to come back and just walk, because it's, you hear the birds and you see all the different plant life. And the whole goal was to try and get people who have been out there vandalizing the place to realize what a beautiful place it is, and to get them to stop doing that. And I thought that was a really neat way to try and get that reconnection back, so that people can really begin to appreciate what's around them.
Yeah, the connection to ancestry is
Mhm.
important too. So that's another wild space that is neglected past and future generations too. Just remembering who we are.
I think anytime though you start to see people evolving not necessarily in the cemetery that's already beautiful, but something where it's run down that has become beautiful. You see people out there working on it. It gives people a sense of respect and ownership in their own community, even if they don't necessarily own something themselves. It starts to make them want to respect where they live and what they do.
Another great service that Bittersweet provides us is work.
I mean,
together.
our school was totally redone over the past 2 years, and Betsy Schmidt, who used to work at Sarah Lawrence in the literature department, who's the director of our school's humanities program now, Data Sen Learning, she put in all of these gorgeous plants around the side of our school, and she gave our school 3 planters, and so I'm going to be in charge of our gardening program next year. And so I'm really excited to teach our kids all about gardening and possibly about composting if I convince them to get their own materials.
You should talk to Greenbridge,
Yeah.
I don't know if they're the ones that came out, but they'll
I
actually
think
help
they
you
were,
with
yeah.
composting.
I talked to 2 nonprofits at Bushwick
Alright.
Open Studios about helping me with composting, and both of them were yes, of course.
Yeah, most places in Brooklyn are on it with composting,
Yeah.
especially.
I was I just need someone to help me because I don't actually know how to do that myself, and I need them to put the garbage at our school somewhere else, not right in front of the garbage.
You should look at the Master Composter program for the city. Look into it. It's interesting, and you
We also
basically
just
become certified.
Waste so much. At our
You'll
school.
learn so much. It'll be great.
Yeah, it's a great program.
Yeah,
Did
I
they
also
do
want
that
the
in
kids to
city?
know
No, I didn't
that we
think
shouldn't
so.
waste as much as we do.
I could put you in touch with
Yeah.
someone, the local elementary school. There's someone there who started the program, I think, 3 to 5 years ago. Now, if you walk around the school, this is an elementary school, this whole wall, there's the wall, and then in front of it are all these raised, and they've got everything, vegetable gardens, flowers, and
So
the kids are out
nice.
there planting, tending, picking strawberries when they're ripe and so forth.
See, that's so
It's
nice.
great.
I
The kids
want,
are totally
I know it's going to be a
engaged in this.
small start because I'm the one really pushing this at our school, and right now I'm the only one who's let's do this. But I feel if I'm really energetic and we just start the year, even if I'm the only one who's yeah, let's do this, eventually other people will feel that
It's
way.
true. I think you got the right idea.
Yeah.
So we've got about, just FYI, we've got about 15 minutes
Oh.
in conventional Western time.
Sorry.
And I feel like we've kind of pulled you far off. I mean, it's been a great discussion,
Yeah.
but if you want to try to
Okay. Well, I
get
can
through
wrap
more
this up a little bit.
things, yeah.
I mean, honestly, this is kind of what I was hoping to happen is people talk and get energized about this stuff. You know, whatever it is, if it's doing something good, call it permaculture, call it anything. You know, it's all about making this place wonderful. So that's kind of another slide, but it kind of segues into what we're talking about right now, which is it's kind of the other side of that. And it's funny because I've worked with transition town people a lot. Transition town, are you all familiar with that? So transition town folks it was a movement started in Europe and then jumped overseas to the States, and the idea is recognizing the reality of peak oil. You know, there is not as much fossil fuel as we would like there to be in order to live like this forever. Eventually we will stop living like this forever. We don't have the infrastructure to have anything other than fossil fuel to sustain this lifestyle. Ergo, things will change. We will experience sustainability, the type of lifestyle that is sustainable forever. If we try to keep doing this forever, we will not benefit from that situation. And so people are saying, okay, well, let's try to build a different way that is less reliant on fossil fuels primarily. And that's been the transition town's main focus is about fossil fuels, but it's related to other things as well. And so it's kind of recognizing the hard reality that things are changing in a very, very short time span. And so, you know, a lot of it involves looking at examples overseas, learning from folks in Cuba who experienced, you know, the peaking of their petroleum imports back in the 60s and 70s, really. Looking at Russia, where you had a central government collapse in the 90s, and how did people endure, you know, the supermarkets there essentially lost state reserves. And, you know, looking ahead and seeing, you know, the future of the overall aquifer being really in peril. That's where most people in this continent get their calories from. There was a third of the corn harvest last year didn't make it to market. Didn't get reported because it's scary and big. You know, we can look at more and more of these things happening in shorter and shorter time spans and increments. And so thinking very realistically and hard-nosedly, you know, how are we going to deal with this? And, you know, it's kind of it's a two-pronged approach, because on the one hand, you can't just sugarcoat everything and say, you know, we're going to plant gardens and everything's beautiful, we'll be fine, because we won't. Things will be hard. But at the same time, you get into that doom and gloom mode and nobody pays attention, because it's a huge wall of panic that everybody, self-included, runs into. And so it's a matter of finding a way to address that wall communally. You know, it's too much weight, too much grief for any one person to hold, I think. And so building safe spaces within our communities to process that grief and fear, but also hope. And, you know, because this is also the end of office building, this is also the end of commuting, this is also the end of all these other, of filling our kids up with pills and sticking them in front of screens. You know, this is the end of a lot of really rotten stuff. This is the end of sweatshops, slave labor, diamond mines, things like that. Shale oil in Nigeria.
Dawning of the age of Aquarius.
Or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
or probably more like a feudal hell for, you know, a couple centuries before things even out. But there are ways to, again, talking about emergent properties, there are things that can be done communally that are fun, that don't address this at all, but that nevertheless increase our resiliency in the same way that you change your aesthetic of gardening to value fecundity and thriving. You plant a bunch of plants together, and so, you know, say you get brown rotten your peaches one year, you still got a bajillion other plants that you can be eating. In the same way, you have a block party every, you know, month and a half with your neighbors and friends. You're building community resilience without even talking about it. And so I think it's important to both have serious conversations and do all of these things to begin to rely on. It's kind of off the bottom advice, but that was what one of my permaculture elders said, you know, that you can choose to rely on people you know, love, and trust for your daily livelihood, or you can be forced to rely on people you don't know, who don't love you, and who you probably shouldn't be trusting. You know, you can get your health care from an HMO, or you can make friends with a doctor. Pretty much. You know, we live in a system that is not necessarily designed for our thriving. And if we want to design something else, we need to both be circumspect about it, but also be active. And the sobering side of permaculture is being aware that things are changing.
So by transition towns, are these just sort of informal, kind of spontaneous grassroots things, or is it actually kind of a movement, kind of linked by the internet or whatever?
Yeah, it's become kind of an international movement. There are people who have deemed themselves local organizers and that sort of thing. And there are folks coming from all different walks of life. Some of them are, hippie back to the landers. Some of them are tech people who are scared about the price of gold. Some people are, it's all different walks of life coming together. And kind of some of the key elements are like co-housing, which is having multiple families living in the same area, sharing, utilities, sharing appliances, that kind of stuff. There's a certain amount of food self-sufficiency and community self-sufficiency. Community gardening is usually an element of it. There's usually an element of home electricity production, so solar panels or wind or geothermal or something like that, if you can afford it. There's been, in the transition town movement, because it's been primarily an affluent Anglo movement, there's been less talk about doing without our privileges and more about how do we sustain this livelihood and lifestyle, and that's been a bit of a bone of contention where it's jumped cultures or socioeconomic groups where folks are saying, well, we did fine without electricity, we never died for want of it, we really need to be talking about water supply and about making sure that our elders and our children are cared for. And so, it's a framework that exists, and so there are people there that will hear your concerns and will call you crazy, basically.
I think most governments now, instead of investing in how to maintain the use of oil, are trying to figure out desalination plants and how to make water drinkable for their people in the future. More so than fossil fuel importance.
Yeah, I guess maybe one of the key ideological components of the transition town movement and other associated things, whether it's the homesteaders or back to the landers or these loosely affiliated eco-anarchists, is the community reliance rather than self-reliance, or rather than institutional reliance. And so, a structure may be formed for that, but essentially that's always subsidiary to the actual human relationships in a place at a given time, which is kind of encouraging. Piece of real politic. Anyway, it exists out there. I think co-counseling, which is now called reevaluation counseling, was started back in the teens and the 20s to deal with mine strikers from the labor movement back when folks were trying to unionize, dealing with just the brutality of daily life, and obviously people who were too poor to afford paying somebody to psychoanalyze them, train themselves kind of in peer psychoanalysis and grief counseling. And so since then it's become this kind of ongoing process refined over the years. And so it's a really good process for kind of community scale brain medicine. And it's good at processing a lot of the emotional baggage that comes up when you start talking about sustainability plans. So, many resources. So one antidote to doom and gloom that depends upon after a conversation like that is do something. Get your hands dirty. There's one thing I didn't put up there that's maybe the most important part of successful work parties, and that's framing it well. In working in community stuff for a while, having a beginning that's held, weaving the basket, the term that Ms. Neutralities used, but you set the tone, you bring everybody's heads together, and usually there's holding hands in a circle or a song in your community, not like that, but somehow to bring people's minds together, and then at the end of it, you bring people together again, and that seems to be, it's like in teaching, you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. It's that whole repetition, what I tell you 3 times is true kind of a thing. But when you're doing like a garden installation or planting trees or something, you hold that space. People carry some of that, the medicine of the place, for want of a better term, with them and make it successful. Beer helps too.
Yeah.
So ideas of the project, these are just kind of random things that I threw on there. Again, talking about honeybee collapse, we're going to need to be relying on other pollinators for fruit and vegetables for the future. Fortunately, native bees, solitary bees, digging bees, miner bees, native butterflies, these are all much, much less in peril 2x4 chunk, drill it full of different sized holes, stick it on a post in your garden, see what comes in that year. Remember what size holes you drill. Drill the size hole that the bees like next year. Boom, instant pollination. And you can make them beautiful, like these examples from Sweden and Norway, where they've been relying on native bees for pollination for a long time. Yeah, quick way to shoot biodiversity up in the garden.
They're really beautiful.
Yeah.
And then forest gardens is kind of the apotheosis of permaculture design, is when you're putting all of this stuff together. Appleseed Permaculture is an outfit out of Massachusetts. Eric Meyer is a big shot in the forest gardening world. That's his outfit. It has this beautiful, I was thinking about putting it up on there, but I realized it would be impossible to read, but it's a pattern language of forest gardening. Pattern language is kind of the, there's an architectural pattern language for this building, for instance, that says, indirect natural lighting, doorways on either side, comfortable places to sit, lots of little nooks. Each of these are, maybe elements in the pattern language. There's another one for landscape design. And so what Appleseed, Meyer, the other folks at Appleseed did was put together, I think, a pretty decent pattern language to start with for designing a forest garden. And so that's what following up on it. Essentially, it's applying what you know about, or what you can learn about forest ecology and plant biology, and essentially replicating the processes of a natural forest with 100% edible, useful medicinal species that you know you're going to use as a human being. They work great, and they look beautiful. Here's some examples of different styles, and it's everything from like the weedy, overgrown orchard to these beautiful circle gardens. It's an exciting way to think about gardens in multiple tiers, multiple structures. So the seven level beneficial yield is kind of the archetype for it. Cool. So the other really useful tool for permaculture, there's two of them on here. One of them is the, hey, that's all right, you come in. We're nearly done. Thinking about the scale of permanence on the landscape, think about the time scale things are taking place at. Yeoman was another Australian who came up with this back in the 50s before permaculture itself got named as such. Just thinking about how long things take to change and how long it takes to remain. Climate you can change in a couple hundred years. People think about 15 million years for things to even out. The shape of the land, hillsides, mountains. A mountaintop removal operation can go on in a matter of years, and it takes millennia for the valleys to flood in, right? Or really, billions of years for the mountains to come back again. Water flow, thinking about building dams, check dams, and ponds and that sort of stuff takes a couple of months to dig that, and it takes a couple thousand years for that to fill in. Beaver ponds and the time span that they've been in existence. Roads. One of my permaculture mentors, this was out in Oregon where there's a lot of clear cutting going on, told us a story about when he was out walking in the woods with some friends of theirs, and they came upon this clear cut, this grove that they were trying to get to, and his friends were bemoaning the loss of these trees and how horrible it was. This is a permanent scar on the land. And Sir Rick said, well, yes, but look, there's already those first seedlings coming back up. This forest is hundreds of years away from being a quote-unquote climax ecosystem. But that road we walk along, that's going to be here after this is desert. The roads last longer than the forest cuts. The compacted earth is incredibly permanent. These roads around here are going to be here long after all these buildings have crumbled down to dust after the forest returns. So thinking about that when you're laying out where roads and parking lots go, sobering. Trees take longer to grow than buildings.
I wish more people understood that.
Yeah.
Because most of the trees we lost in Sandy were because of some kind of construction that they were doing. They just chopped the roots, the trees blew over a few years later, and most people won't even correlate it with that, even the people that just decided to put the buildings there.
Yeah, I know.
Or putting roads there.
For every good, awesome arborist, there's some yahoo's going to top a tree for a power line.
Yeah.
There's a poster in our church. I think it's this ancient Cree setting. I love this poster. It says, think it's only after the last tree has been cut and the last fish has been taken from the river when we realize that we can't eat money.
Oh,
I just thought, oh God, if more people understood that,
that's
we'd be in
amazing.
a much better.
That's scary though.
Yeah, it is.
It is. I wonder, yeah, I mean, kids growing up in places where there is none still think you can eat money. Well, that will change. But yeah, so prioritizing trees rather than buildings, thinking about that, 3 to 5 times the width of a tree is what the root space it needs. What that means as far as layout. And buildings, that whole, the Amish barn raising, they build their structures to be impermanent. Every culture that has lasted more than a couple million, or a couple thousand years without eating the crap out of their neighbors has lived in impermanent structures. It's very, very important to live in places that require repair because you need to bring people, if you don't need to bring people together, you won't bring people together. It's like that whole idea of you want your garden to require a bit of work so that you bring people in. So thinking intentionally about not only growing up, there's that Oxford dining hall story. So there's these 2 big tall oak trees growing in the Oxford campus forest, and eventually over time these 2 big posts in the dining hall there started to fracture and split. And they were looking around and they found these 2 trees that were just perfect size. They went through their old record books and found these were planted knowing that they would reach the size necessary to replace the post at the time the post would crack.
That's awesome.
Thinking ahead like that is part of the process. It gives me chills to think that
Yeah.
scale. And then subdivision of land, this is property lines, this is zoning ordinances. You can fix that in a couple of days and allow voice at the county office, and it'll last for a couple generations and won't change back. Land changes hands with every civil war. It happens pretty quick in civilized society. And then in soil, here's the positive side of that. Soil, a couple minutes with your broad fork and a handful of kelp meal, and you're going to be benefiting that landscape for years, decades to come. A little bit of sheep mulch goes a long way. Visioning exercises, I think, are another really powerful permaculture process or land care process. Getting together, especially in a group. So all this stuff is always better to do with other people around. But just really think about what do you love about the place where you live. What was it that drew you to that place? Be really specific about what are the elements of the land that you like about that space, and how do you work with that landscape to highlight those elements to really respect them and bring them out. Thinking about also practically things. Look at paths probably aren't going to change. The shortcut that everybody takes diagonal lines across the lawn, it's always going to be there. They'll just put a sidewalk there. That's the way they're going to walk anyway. Thinking about down the scale of permanence. What are the things that are going to again meet that vision of the land in a good way, feeling what's going on in that space, and then go nuts with the rest of it. Pretend you got an unlimited budget, and then you can use the patterns that you are able to determine from that ideal vision to apply to that space. And that's everything from a city lot to an entire farmstead. But visioning, again, it's one of those like nebula things. It's one of those things that just gets our minds in a different space. And so these are just some examples of the permaculture aesthetic that people have come up with over the years. It's everything from straight lines to rounded spaces. That's an old English public space garden in the middle there. That meadow has been a meadow for a couple hundred years, just because the city or the township valued the public green, and that patch of wildflowers is drawing in the pollinators that are keeping everybody's cottage garden going all summer long.
What's that building on the right?
Yeah.
That is from somewhere in Thailand.
That's amazing.
A bunch of Thai hippies made this crazy treehouse nonsense construction. It's beautiful. I want to live for that.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. There's a friend of mine who at permaculture school who was an architect, and it's like it was very, very Dutch. I can't do a Dutch accent, but he had a very strong Dutch accent. He said, we live in these phallic structures. Do you want to live in a phallus or a womb? You must live in the womb. Now go away from straight lines and corners. Round has a different feel to them. Again, it's something you see so everyone's for revolution. So anyway, you should probably steal these books. But yeah, if you know a little bit of basic botany and you know about a little bit of basic entomology, you can pretty much piece together everything else. And, I used to think it was all about patterns, it's all about learning shapes and functions, but really, the more I do this stuff, the more I realize that it all comes from the biology and the ecology of the organisms themselves. A lot of familiarity with that seems like it's pretty important to pull this stuff off well.
If you don't know those things, how often will you respond to my emails?
All the time. Almost all the time. I live with that figuring network telephone, so I think maybe a little bit of time between, but shoot me a line anytime. And then here, so foodscapes.com, SeaWellFoodscapes.com is going to have, there's an education tab on there. This is my landscaping business in Charlottesville that we do applied permaculture design for people. So we've got a page that has all of the slideshows like this that we've done for the past year or so. And so it's got this, we've got, it's just a slide, so this context isn't really there, but at least you'll be able to have access to all of these diagrams and stuff that you can expand larger and actually read a little fine print on them. So, okay. That's kind of what I had today. I was thinking about doing a plank walk with it, but it's a little intense.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was amazing.
Cool. Sam, thanks for coming and enjoying my walk today. Any questions or anything like that? Sure.
Go Ben.
What's up?
Go Ben.
You know what you make me think of? Here's a test for you. Take you back to the old days. Do you remember how Odysseus designs the bed that he shares with Penelope? I was thinking about that with your Oxford story.
Right, hand planing the bed to, what did he sized it to their own bodies, right?
No, Penelope gets the best of him after he's slaughtered all the suitors, and she still wants to make sure this is her husband. So she says to the maidservant, take him out to the portico and make the bed for him. And Odysseus erupts and says, "Lady, how can you say that? I built the bed by planing an olive tree, but by adzing the sides of the olive tree. That became the foundation post of our bed. It can't be moved. If it's moved, it means you cut it from the trunk. So it's kind of permaculture idea of building the whole house around this kind of foundational tree. It's a really beautiful, powerful image. So,
An old way of doing houses too, like a lot of places, like the center post for the round house is called the tree or something like that. Big draws of the world tree at the center, the temple of the world.
There was an article in the New York Times, I don't know, about 6 months ago. Did you see this, Fred, about this fellow, I forget his name, but he lives in Washington State, and he's a kind of, folk artist who has big property. He's just designed these fantastic houses.
Oh,
Must
yeah.
have, like, half
He
a
didn't hire
dozen
logs going through his house.
Yeah,
It was like he and his wife or the woman that he lived with. Yeah, it was beautiful.
You read that?
Yeah, it was so eccentric on the inside. It was awesome. Some of the spaces looked almost too much, and then other ones were like amazing.
Yeah, really, yeah.
Really wild and cool.
Something else occurred to me talking about permaculture and going back to the MyDo stuff. I do have, or had anyway, a blog, permaculture blog online under the moniker of Laughing Crow Permaculture, which is the outfit that I was doing workshops for a while. And most of it was crap, but there's one really good article I read on looking at the linguistic permaculture of oak trees and why acorns come from oak trees and not acorn trees or oak nuts. Which is kind of, it tells that it's the ecological history of oak arboriculture in Old England. And it's a nice article. So worth reading.
There was this woman that I worked with at the garden, and she was Irish, and she would talk about the old, like, I forget what she actually called them. They were like the 5 or 6 most important trees, but they were like holy trees, but they were Gaelic. And it was like the holly was a sacred trees. I'm sorry. It was a holly that there was whatever oak it was in Ireland. I'm not sure. the Taxus, and like I think there were like 2 or 3 others.
The hazel and the
Probably.
beach or something.
Maybe it was the beach. I don't know about the hazel. But yeah, it was amazing. But they were like the sacred trees where if you touch them, it had to be certain times and like very respectfully, and it only harvest what you.
It's funny because the more time I spend on the land working with this stuff, just through a purely ecological gardening perspective, the more I'm realizing the subtler things that these old stories and these old folk tales are referring to. It's not just an arbitrary,
Yeah.
there's a reason that the word true is the same root as oak tree. Like druid comes from the same root structure. True, before it became the true-false dichotomy, meant, of reliable character, which is a very oak-like thing. But we still have that sense of that connotative value in there. But I feel like that more and more I'm feeling like that awareness of that.
It wasn't really
Some layer of
superstition
things.
or like it wasn't for no reason at all. There was a direct reason.
Yeah. There's a subtle awareness that comes from a long time spent with that.
I
Again,
know.
medicine is the word that seems best, but I don't know.
I noticed in your slide you spelled Holyoke like the tree, and I wondered if that was a deliberate choice or just
I probably misspelled it.
Misspelling.
That's funny. Yeah, right.
You can claim it as having meaning.
Well, that's really cool because that is such a beat up, kind of gritty.
Well, I don't
New
know. It
England
never
city,
occurred to
so
me
it's
whether that
cool
comes
that it
from.
has that, yeah.
I suspect it doesn't come from Holyoke, like the tree. That's not there. It's probably an Indian word of some kind. But, still.
So how many Maidu are there now?
There are, gosh, about a couple hundred, not a lot. It's small. They got divided. There was three groups that got kind of collapsed into the Maidu. There was the mountain Maidu, the Nishna Maidu, and the Saida Maidu. And so mountain Maidu are the people from the mountains, obviously. The Nishna Maidu are Nishna means like good looking. Good looking Maidu. Saida Maidu were the really tall guys. Saida means the tall skinny fella. And they all spoke a slightly different dialect of the Maidu language, and so there were 3 separate bands. But then when the Spanish came in, they put everybody on the Rancheria. They moved everybody to Roseville, which is downhill. Their Maidu were kind of in the Central Sierra and the Blue Oak Savannah, which is kind of mid-slope between like the conifer forest peaks and the valley swamps. So they moved them down into the swamps and took over their land for initially not much. And then when the gold miners came in, they just destroyed the rivers looking for gold and ranched afterwards. And then them and the Miwok, which are sort of the next linguistic grouping down, had a long-term alliance where both all the Central California language groups, they call it the Penutian language group, not because it's a real linguistic grouping, but because a lot of them have a shared trade language. Pene means two, and Ute means acorn, and they call Penutian because most of those people in that place call two Pene and call acorns Ute. So I guess they call it their language group. And then they got done a disservice when Alfred Kroger, one of the most famous for meat and Ishi, the last wild person in North America, who was, Yurok maybe? Anyway, his village got wiped out. He took to the hills for a bunch of years until he just couldn't take the loneliness anymore and came down and struck up a friendship with Kroger, who was Ursula Kroger Le Guin's father. And so, it's interesting as you read Ursula Le Guin's stuff, and it has you can see the California Indian culture running through a lot of her works because she spent so much time with Ishi as a kid.
What's her name?
Ursula Le Guin, the author.
Oh, I have
So,
no.
Left Hand of Darkness, Earthsea Trilogy,
Right.
kind of anthropological science fiction.
That's cool.
But anyway, so Kroger, unfortunately, he traveled all over the place, but he didn't spend very much time with the Maidu, and he didn't speak the language so well, and he didn't really speak with the respondents that well, so he made them seem like there were a lot less of them than there actually were, and that they described them as an offshoot of the Miwok, which is not true. through it all. And so when Eisenhower, years and years later, was going through the lists of enrolled Indian tribes and was kind of sending his BIA to say, who can we cut from the rolls to trim money, looked at Kroger's notes on the Maidu saying, well, these people aren't really a people, they're a hybrid of this and this culture. He said, well, these people aren't really real, so they struck with the rolls. And so they stopped getting federal funding, the rancheria stopped getting funded, and so it happened at the time when they're under increased racist predation by cattle ranchers who were now at this point the sons of the people who had in many ways taken on a lot of the Maidu ecological stuff. The cattle ranchers practiced the rotational grazing, the silo pasturing, and the seasonal burning that the Maidu had been doing just because it made for healthy pasturage. And so the sons of them who wanted to urbanize and distance themselves from their podunk parents kicked the Maidu off the land wholesale, reverted to more traditional, Euro-American style pasturing routines and gold mining, and then it just kind of went downhill from there. It was onward. So, fortunately, the town of Nevada City and Nevada County there's been an increasingly hybridized local culture between the Maidu and the Anglos there. There's now Maidu traditions that are celebrated by everybody in the town. They do the calling back the salmon ceremony every fall when the salmon are running up the rivers. And so all the salmon fishermen go out in the rivers and physically they pick up the fish and they carry them over the dams so they can get back to the spawning ground. It's amazing, the care for these creatures. Just this old tradition that's still honored.
How do the schools incorporate it? If you know.
There's Maidu history incorporated into the school history unit. It's a mix. There's still the people who are Yegra, gold mining, pioneer America kind of thing, and then there's the folks who are recognizing the ancestral traditions there too. Unfortunately, in civic government right now, there's a way more libertarian, progressivist, nativist leaning. When I was last there, the mayor made it her personal project to get Nevada City food independent within 5 years. As far as I know, they did it.
That's
An entire city that is not reliant on imports for food.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and way into adapting Maidu land care for fire protection because it works. And so that's a positive story. Roseville's a different story. It's gotten worse there. Nevada City is nice.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Are you from California?
No, I